I am obviously very honored to be here, and so far the discussion has been wonderful, so I'm hoping that I don't disappoint. However, there it is. My question is about the relationship between authority, epistemic authority, and epistemic expertise. And we'll begin with the background assumption. Human beings are finite and fallible epistemic agents. On her own, each of us knows and understands very little. On her own, each of us is apt to make mistakes. But luckily, however, we don't all have the same limitations and liabilities. Some people know and understand what others do not. Some are in a position to correct errors that others make. We pool our assets and compensate for our individual liabilities. And a critical question is how we do so, and how we should do so. Well, a familiar and correct answer is that we depend on testimony. We rely on others for information that we lack. This reliance may be because of purely circumstantial differences. So this is an example from Craig. Fred is up a tree, Fred has climbed the tree, and he sees a predator approaching. He's not a particular expert on predators, he just happens to be in a position to see it, so he can warn the rest of us. And if I consider him competent and sincere, I have reason to take his word that a predator is approaching. Similarly, if Anna's a stranger in town, she has reasons to take Mark's word as to where the railroad station is, assuming, again, that he's competent and sincere, particularly because we have a convention where it's perfectly permissible to say, I don't know, if you don't know. So you're not going to lose face. There's no reason. It's not a, forced choice answer. You can simply bow out. And because we have these ways of approaching problems, information transfer is usually, about mundane manners anyway, is usually pretty smooth. But it's not always the case that information transfer is only between people who are epistemically similarly situated without regard to anything other than circumstantial differences. Some people have deeper or broader or more textured understandings of an issue and the viable ways to approach it. So physicians, auto mechanics, engineers, and dietitians fall into this group. They don't just have more information, we think, they're more proficient. They know how to approach certain issues and think about them in ways that we do not and often cannot. They may be, in certain respects, we suspect, just smarter than we are. And this isn't just a matter of having the appropriate credentials. It might be a purely circumstantial advantage. It might be that they're just more talented. But for one reason or another, we regard them properly as our epistemic superiors. And the question is, what's the nature of the superiority? How should we respond on finding out whether someone has a considerable epistemic advantage with respect to a particular belief? Well, often this is cashed out in terms of what's called epistemic authority vis-a-vis a given subject. But I want to argue we should approach the notion of epistemic authority with caution. And because I think authority is different from expertise, not quite in the way that Michel said, but I think that there's an important difference here that we ought to mark. Now, it might seem that this is a terminological matter. Call it one, call it the other, whatever. And I don't actually care about the terminology, but I think there is an important distinction, and I'm going to use the terminology to trace that distinction. It's not quite conceptual analysis, but I am not being completely arbitrary either. You'll be glad to know. So let's start with authority. An authority is someone who has legitimate power to do something where that power derives from a role in a social or political process. In suitable circumstances, a judge has the authority to impose a fine, a referee has the authority to call a foul, an officiant has the authority to conduct a wedding ceremony, a professor has the authority to set term paper deadlines. An authority is vested with specific legitimate powers by and within a particular practice. The powers carry permissions, prohibitions, rights, and obligations that others, even other participants in that practice, lack. The judge can impose a fine, the bailiff cannot. The player can't call a foul, but the referee can. And although we might hope that those in authority display the relevant competences, competence is not required. Although the ref can make a bad call, but the foul still stands. He can consistently make bad calls, but until his authority is rescinded, his foul calls still stand. And although I can impose totally unreasonable deadlines on my students, so long as they're within the broad parameters the university sets, my students are subject to my authority to set those deadlines. In some practices, under some conditions, it's possible to appeal to a higher authority. But in the end of the chain of appeals, authority settles the matter. Nevertheless, an authority's action is open to criticism. Because it's the act of someone vested with legitimate power to act, the verdict still stands. Still, students justifiably complain about the deadlines I set. Fans justifiably disparage bad calls in football. As participants in a practice, they're obliged to accede to the verdict, but they need not and often do not go quietly. Moreover, the critics are often quite knowledgeable. They understand the practice and the ways it's designed to promote certain goods. They understand why ill-advised exercises of authority impede the production of those goods. The calls that they deem bad are in fact bad. So, exercises of authority are subject to epistemic assessment. The conception of authority I've been discussing is independent of epistemology. Practices define roles and confer certain powers on those who play those roles. They determine under what circumstances one person can call a foul, impose a fine, or conduct a marriage ceremony. Those who play those roles need not have any special talents or abilities. They just are vested with this authority. And they may perform those roles well or badly. It makes no difference. Even if the ref is blind, as the fans charge, his claim that it's a foul still stands. The critical issue then is that the authority is vested in someone to do something. Well, we sometimes speak about epistemic or intellectual authority, and this I think is quite different. So Roger Penrose is an authority on black holes. Marjorie Garber is an authority on Shakespeare's sonnets. But I think this location is not a good one because there's no reason to think that Penrose and Garber have any professional rights to do anything that other physicists and critics are barred from doing. They're just smarter than we are, more knowledgeable, more acute, more creative than the rest of us. To call them authorities is to suggest that they have legitimate powers to do things that others are barred from doing. And that's just false. Moreover, their views can be and often are successfully challenged. Their assertions do not go without saying. Some of the challenges are effective. Then the acceptability of their claims is undermined. I suggest this makes them experts, not authorities. Expertise is an epistemic achievement. An expert is epistemically considerably more adept than those who draw on her expertise. Expertise is not, however, an absolute measure of epistemic accomplishment, on my view. It's a comparative state, deriving from there being a considerable gap between the epistemic accomplishments of different people. One has a greater understanding, know-how, or knowledge than others. As a result, an agent may qualify as an expert in one context and an epistemic peer in another. Expertise is, of course, keyed to epistemic areas. An expert in one area, maybe auto mechanics or medicine, is a novice in another, maybe astronomy or poetry. Expertise involves a threshold. There's a lower bound. Where there's a considerable gap between the ignorant and the woefully ignorant, the merely ignorance grasp of a topic is well below the norm. The ignorant party does not qualify as an expert. And here the example is students in the remedial math class. Some are worse than others, but none of them would qualify as an expert because they don't come up to the threshold. So we might think that expertise is a matter of really knowing a lot more than most people. This is something Judy Thompson said at one point. But I think that that's not right either. Plenty of first-time parents treat more experienced parents as experts about childcare, seeking information about matters about how to soothe a teething baby, or when the baby's going to sleep through the night, or whether there's something worrisome about one thing or another that their child is doing. Experienced parents, they're the majority. They're not some sort of special elite, but you call on them because they know a lot more than you do. And I gotta say, I benefited a huge amount from what I call playground expertise. So the idea that you have to be better than most rather than just better than me is a rather important point here. There are other cases where you might say, okay, is more knowledgeable. And here there's a worry, and that's where knowledge is sparse. For example, the behavior and constitution of dark matter. There's a gap between experts and novices, but nobody knows much about dark matter. Pretty much all that anybody knows is that there's a lot of it, and there has to be a lot of it to account for the behavior of matter that we can discern in the universe. The experts don't know more than most people because most people know nothing. And the experts probably have false beliefs. But there are experts in dark matter because they know how to approach the area, they know how to entertain hypotheses, they know how different hypotheses would be tested or what's to be said for and against them. And the idea that there can be expertise in a field where knowledge is enormously sparse, I think is something we have to take account of. Now, expertise is valuable because experts can provide the novices with trustworthy resources for extending their epistemic range. This is obviously a Goldman point. Goldman holds that this is having a higher proportion of true beliefs and a lower proportion of false beliefs than the population at large. But I just suggested that the issue about dark matter calls this into question, because the public at large, number one, has no views on it, and among the people who do have views, they know that a lot of those views are false. There's still going to be a problem here. But I do agree that the experts are epistemically more accomplished than the novices. I just think that talking about what counts as the accomplishment is much more than divvying out the proportion of true and false beliefs. Now, you might say, okay, we've got a terminological issue here, and as I said, I don't care about the terminological issue. I do care about the distinction. So I want to turn to Linda Zabzebski's work, because she does not think that the term authority is ambiguous, meaning one thing in the epistemic case, another thing in the other cases. Rather, she takes the characterization I gave of authority and thinks as it stands, it applies in the epistemic realm. There are epistemic authorities who have powers and responsibilities that the rest of us lack. And if she's right, then there are people who, with respect to particular propositions, P is wholly justified for novice S because A believes that P. So the authority believes it, and that makes it wholly justified for me, the novice. And she does this because she endorses the preemption thesis, which says, and this is a direct quote, "The fact that the authority has a belief P is a reason for me to believe P that replaces my other relevant reasons, reasons relevant to believing P, and is not simply added to them." And there are several features of this preemption thesis that are worthy of attention. First of all, it's a replacement thesis. The epistemic authority believes P replaces, rather than merely augmenting, my other relevant reasons. The second is that it's the mere fact that an authority believes that P, not my knowledge or awareness or epistemic access to the fact that the authority believes it, that triggers the replacement. And the third point, and this is something that Christoph has emphasized, is she says that the authority's belief is a reason to believe that P, not the reason, but the fact replaces any reasons I might have to believe that P, or to believe that not P. So she treats it as a conclusive reason. And I think this is really quite an astounding constellation of claims. Astoundingly scary, if you want the truth. She holds that epistemic authorities can command belief, that is, rightly require that their claims be believed. Well, I'm not convinced that we can believe at will, so I'm not convinced that we can believe on command. She maintains that speakers command belief because they say, believe me, P. And she thinks that the fact that we issue such a command is reason to think that the command can be obeyed. Well, I'm not even sure about that's true about commands, but my main point is that I'm not sure that believe me, P, is a command. Rather, I think it functions to advise or implore. That makes exception optional, even though I'm kind of standing behind my claim. The phrase indicates that the utterer is strongly commanded to the correctness of P and thinks it's desirable that the hearer accept it. The most that follows is that the speaker holds that the listener stands to make a serious error if she does not agree. But it does not follow that she's under any obligation to agree, or even that she should agree. Boston sports fans are apt to say, believe me, the Red Sox will win this year. Well, right now, nobody knows whether they will win, and the track record is not promising. So the fact that we can go around saying, believe me, they'll win, is at least a weak reason to tell you I'm commanding that you believe this, because it would be idiotic of you to believe me right now. Even if A is more epistemically accomplished than S in a given area, and can appreciate that S will make a big mistake if she does not believe as A does, it doesn't follow that A can command agreement. Zagzebski insists that believing on the basis of authority is not the same as believing on the basis of testimony. The mere fact that an epistemic superior believes that P gives a novice conclusive reason to believe that P. The novice need not entertain that P, that is, consider whether P is true or credible. The mere fact is enough. Nor does he even have to grasp the content of P. Even if he does not understand what P says, the fact that an epistemic superior believes it constitutes a conclusive reason for him to agree. I should thus believe everything written in the current issue of Science, inasmuch as the authors are all my epistemic superiors, and I should believe it even without having scanned the table of contents. More alarmingly, I should believe whatever an epistemic superior believes, even if it's not vetted by peer review. Indeed, even if it's not communicated. So suppose there's a scientific institute in a remote valley in the Himalayas where epistemically superior investigators pursue their inquiries. One is investigating an obscure topic. Let's make it the gastric juices of the common housefly. He comes to believe that the gastric juices have a particular chemical composition, and maybe his research is impeccable. I have no epistemic access to his findings, but according to Zagzebski, I should believe what he does. I've never given the issue a moment's thought, and it even took me a long time to come up with this example, which shows you how little I've thought about it. But I should follow his lead and come to a well-founded belief. Of course, I have no reason to believe that this is the case. Nevertheless, I should believe as he does. Suppose another scientist studies something that I've casually investigated, but never studied rigorously. Perhaps the issue is whether the severity of winters has any bearing on the date when the first robin appears. I didn't do any systematic investigation. I have a very rough and ready correlation based on what I see in my backyard. Again, no research. Still, I should scrap my view according to Zagzebski and believe his. I suggest that what Zabzebski is actually advocating is blind, ignorant acquiescence. If reliabilism is correct, and she thinks it is, then such blind, ignorant acquiescence often yields blind, ignorant knowledge. It's knowledge, but there's a problem. Many problems, but anyway. Well, reliabilism is a form of consequentialism. The good it aims is to believe as many truths as possible and disbelieve as many falsehoods as possible. Reasons and evidence are merely instrumentally valuable. They should be set aside if a better instrument becomes available. Blind allegiance to the views of an epistemic authority is, on Zabzebski's view, a better instrument. But if I do not know or reasonably believe that an epistemic superior believes that P, I have no basis for believing that P. All the reasons I have access to, we assume, do not support P. Granted, my evidence is limited and it might be skewed. Still, it seems better to believe or disbelieve or suspend judgment on the basis of evidence that I have rather than something that's just sort of out there somewhere. Even if I don't understand the content of P, she says I should believe it. But it's not clear at that point what belief comes to. So here's a quote, a direct quote from an abstract that appeared in Science in 2022. The Na plus NaLi system was shown to have only approximately 4% loss probability in a fully spin polarized state. Got that? Should I believe that? I have no idea what it just said. I mean, I really don't. It's something in quantum chemistry. And it's quite clear that the authors are my epistemic superiors. So I should believe it. But the question, what does that come to? I mean, I can nod sagely and say, yes, if anybody actually asks me that very question. Is it the case that? But it's nothing I could do anything with. I can't draw inferences from it. I can't do any action on the basis of it. It's very, very, very shallow. Any inference I would draw would be completely trivial. Well, ought implies can, and I don't see how it's possible to believe what's totally unintelligible to me. So what about the case where I have some grasp of the content and recognize that an epistemic superior thinks otherwise? And in one case, I understand up to a point what P claims, but have no views about whether it is so. Even here, it's not obvious whether I should adopt the views of an epistemic superior. If I recognize that she has reasons and I have none, and the topic is not too important, maybe I should accept her view. But even where I have no antecedent opinion, serious cases are much more problematic. Suppose I have no medical training, which is true, and my oncologist tells me that I have a small cell lung cancer and that chemotherapy is the treatment with the best prognosis. In such a case, at least in the United States, patients are standardly advised to get a second opinion. Don't take my word for it is the mantra there. It's quite clear my oncologist knows more than I do and is an expert in the field. But that's not good enough. Before I embark on a risky course of medical treatment, I should find out what the consensus among the experts is. I don't go with the expert I happen to wander into the office of. Now, suppose I'm not a complete novice in the area. Say I'm not an oncologist, but I do have a medical degree. Although she says that P, perhaps that small cell lung cancer is best treated with chemotherapy, I happen to believe that not P, maybe thinking that radiation is more effective. Even then, Zabzebski maintains, my epistemic superior's opinion preempts my own. I should set aside my opinion and my reasons for it. She says I can still hold on to my reasons, but they should not figure in what I believe. I have no idea what that means. In effect, I should take them offline. Although I can see how it might be reasonable for me to think that my reasons are maybe irrelevant or inconclusive. You've got a weak argument for it. I've got a strong one. Okay, that's that. I understand that. But saying that I should simply replace my reasons rather than downgrading their force seems really problematic. Catherine Dormady argues that preemption, it seems particularly odd in cases where I happen to agree with my epistemic superior. Suppose I believe that P and have what I consider good reasons to believe that P. On learning that an epistemic superior agrees with me, it would seem that I now have better reasons to believe that P. Very consoling. But if my reasons are preempted, then they have no effect on what I should believe. Rather than having better reasons to believe that P, I now just have different reasons. And the fact that P was what I thought all along and had good reason to think, that's irrelevant. So epistemically, I'm in the same position as a novice who antecedently believed that not P. There was no advantage to all of these reasons I had when Frederica knew nothing and now we're both in the same position. In supporting her position, Zabzewski turns to Raz. And although her preemption position applies to cases even where I lack epistemic access to superiors' beliefs, Raz's principle seems to assume that I do have access. So they're more limited in scope and actually more plausible than the preemption thesis. For our purposes, the first principle is the most important. The authority of another person's belief for me is justified by my conscientious judgment that I'm more likely to form a true belief and avoid a false belief if I believe what the authority believes than if I try to figure out for myself what to believe. That's Raz. My epistemic superior about a subject is more likely to harbor true beliefs and to eschew false ones about a subject than I am. So if I want to arrive at the truth, I should follow his lead. I want to suggest that even on this view, things are more problematic than they seem. And the reason is because the unit of analysis is very important here. Zabzewski and Raz, I think, take it that we calculate the probability of candidates for belief one by one. And I suggest they implicitly assume that time is short. If I need to decide on this very proposition right now, preemption may make sense. So here's a case. Felix, a recent mediocre graduate of a military academy, finds a ticking time bomb in downtown Chicago. It's set to go off in 4 minutes. The bomb's connected to the timer with a red wire and a blue wire. If the correct wire is cut, the bomb will be diffused. If the wrong one is cut, the bomb will immediately explode. Felix had some instruction in bomb diffusing in school and thinks the red wire should be cut. But Lissa, his epistemic superior in the matter, is also on the scene, and she believes that they should cut the blue wire. Well, because it's a life and death situation, the only downstream issue worth considering is whether they and those who are nearby will survive. Because the bomb's about to explode, there's no opportunity to consult further, to get second opinions. It seems the best strategy for Felix is to believe Lissa and act accordingly. But notice that this case is highly artificial. As Adam Elgin says about such cases, it's practically a cartoon. I mean, you can just see, a Roadrunner cartoon of this. To say that we should blindly follow an epistemic superior, silence our own views, and hope for the best in such a case gives us no insight into what we should do in more standard cases. Recall the advice about getting a second opinion. If there's time to look further, Felix is simply replacing his reasons with Lissa's is unduly risky. It would do better to find out what others who are her equals or superiors in bomb diffusing think. To believe that P, merely because someone else does, deprives me of information about why P, about how my belief with P relates to other things I might believe. This is the unit of analysis point. Once the bomb is diffused, Felix would do well to go back and consider what his reasons were, where they went wrong if they did, what related matters he might also be wrong about. To ask such questions requires not setting one's reasons aside. It's going through your reasons and saying, where did I go wrong? This requires examining them and examining the weights one attaches to them. And it requires a more holistic perspective. Rather than assessing candidates for belief one by one, we should survey the tapestry of commitments they'll be woven into. I'm not saying that Felix should retain his original belief. I am saying that he should consider the content of his belief, the reasons for it, and the content of the replacement list it provides, and ask how adopting it will affect what other things he has reason to believe. He might find that his reasons generally support his conclusion, but they're rather weak. He might find that one of them is flawed. He might find that focusing on the color of the wires was completely irrelevant, and the factor that Lissa was looking at was something he overlooked. Preemption divorces us from these resources. It says we've set it all aside, so we don't have them anymore. Zagzebski argues for preemption on the grounds that the epistemic superior's opinions are more likely to be true than the novice's. But even so, the epistemic superior is fallible. Presumably, the novice should come to believe that not P on learning that his superior's belief was false. So, learning that your superior got it wrong, you at least know what to think next. But what should he do if he learns that his superior's belief that P was unfounded? That is, if he learns that her views were inadequate, her reasons for them were inadequate, I mean. If prior to the encounter with the superior's belief, the novice had believed that not P, then at the time when he thought that not P, he thought it had a greater than 50% probability. On replacing his belief with the superiors, he now has to drastically lower his assessment of the probability that not P. He therefore has to either repudiate some of his reasons, downgrade the weight he attached to them, or revise his standards for how much evidence is required to support such a claim. When he finds out that the belief was unfounded, can he or should he simply resurrect his earlier reasons, the weights he attached to them, or his previous standards of evidence? However this is decided, the conviction that replacement is simply a matter of setting one's beliefs aside is false. Minimally, the replacer has to repudiate the belief that his reasons were sufficient. Even if one's a reliabilist, the conviction that candidates should be vetted one at a time is problematic. Replacing my belief that not P with my superior's belief that P is epistemically costly. Other beliefs have to lose support as well. The holist would argue that rather than simply considering whether the belief that P is more likely to be true than the belief that not P, it's better to assess the truth likelihood of the constellation of beliefs that will be affected by changing one's belief about P. So you have to look at the ripple effects, basically. There's a final worry about the preemption thesis, and that's that it's vulnerable to self-refutation. Epistemology is subject to its own strictures. So suppose an epistemic superior in the field of epistemology thinks that the preemption thesis is false. Then because he's my superior, and I accept the preemption theory, I should reject it. But if I reject it, I'm violating its strictures. The fate of the thesis seems to hang on the hope that no epistemic superiors are internalists. It's so deeply grounded in externalism that the fact that you can refute it if you're, I mean, suppose okay, let's admit, Ernie Souza's our epistemic superior. The jig is up, because he would say, don't accept this principle. And if we accept it, we reject it. If we reject it, we can't accept it. We're in trouble. So let's turn a little bit to the bit about expertise. Goldman points out that there are experts in areas other than areas that are captured in propositions. There are expert tennis players who really know how to play the game. And this may be embodied knowledge that she can't articulate in words, so it's not as though we think that she's going to come up with the algorithm for, making a powerful serve. But she knows how to play. But since we're focusing on propositional matters, I'll set this kind of case aside. So why is construing epistemic superiors as experts rather than authorities preferable? Well, Catherine maintains that rather than preemption, an epistemic superior's belief should be considered rebutting defeaters. She considers such a belief a rebutting defeater because she holds that the epistemic superior has considered all the evidence I have for my belief and found it wanting. And maybe she's got additional beliefs that I don't have, but she's incorporated all of my reasons. But the fact that my epistemic superior and I seek to decide whether the same proposition is true does not entail that we use the same evidence. If we don't, then without examining the evidence, we can't tell whether it's a rebutting defeater or an undercutting defeater. So suppose my epistemic superior concludes on the basis of DNA evidence that the butler stole the spoons. I believe otherwise because of my assessment of the butler's character. I don't know anything about DNA evidence. I didn't resort to it. I just have known him for years, and I don't think he stole the spoons. My superior as a forensic scientist has better evidence than I do, so ceteris paribus, I should believe as he does. I should say that the DNA evidence overrides my assessment of character. If so, his belief constitutes an undercutting defeater, but not a rebutting one. Now, you might say, are we getting into the realm of quibbles here? Yes, we are. But the reason I bring it up is because I think it's important to recognize that the epistemic terrain is more intricate than the discussions about epistemic authority recognize. There are cases where we have rebutting defeaters, cases where we have undercutting defeaters, cases where we have evidence that is or is not sufficient. And I don't think you can just set this aside by saying, go with the superior one and let it settle there. There are a couple of other issues about preemption that I want to mention. First of all, it disincentivizes personal epistemic improvement. Why should a student learn physics or history or auto mechanics if he's never going to achieve sufficient mastery to become an epistemic authority in that field? His own epistemic accomplishments will always be preempted, since epistemic superiors in these fields abound. On an exam where he's asked to explain, that is, give reason to think that P is the case, ought he answer, that's what my epistemically superior prize-winning professor believes. You can't do that. You are not going to pass the exam if you just say, that's what she said in lecture. It diminishes the value of finding things out for yourself. One should simply identify the epistemic superior in each area of inquiry, accept whatever the authority holds. I think this strategy is obviously epistemically irresponsible, and it's probably morally irresponsible as well. I don't think you can just simply offload your responsibilities this way. There's another issue. Preemption seems also to make it presumptuous to ask an epistemic superior what his reasons are for his belief. Suppose, why should they adduce evidence for P if their epistemic superiority is sufficient conclusive evidence for P? Consider the following case. If there are epistemic authorities, I am probably the world's epistemic authority on Nelson Goodman's philosophy. I don't think there's any contender. Still, I can't invoke my standing to close down an argument or settle a question about P, about Goodman's work. So if, for example, Federica says, I think his talk about features compromises his nominalistic stance, what I can't say is I'm the authority, believe what I do. I just can't do that. I have to say something that bears on whether it compromises his stance. And on Zabzewski's view, the fact that I'm the world's authority means my opinion is not only a reason, but a conclusive reason for her to accept my view about it. And I think this is completely crackpot. I don't think that anybody should accept my views just because I happen to have studied this issue a bit further than other people have. So these considerations suggest that there's a problem with the goal of one by one trying to ascertain whether this very proposition is more likely to be true than false. At least one of our epistemic goals is to deepen our understanding. And arguably, acceding to authorities does extend our range because now we have beliefs about stuff beyond our ken, but it does so at the cost of making the understanding very shallow. There's very little you can do with something if all you know is, I think so because he thinks so. It's also uncongenial to education and reason-giving, and it impedes our support for our beliefs. If my only reason for believing that P is that I have it on authority, I don't know what to make of it or what to do with it. It's just a bit of trivia at that point. Information that I glean solely from an epistemic authority is shallow. By replacing my reasons for believing that P or for believing that not P, I lose valuable information, both about the phenomena and also about my grasp of the phenomena. I mean, there's a lot of self-knowledge that is lost when I just throw all the reasons I had out. Still, I'm dependent on others. Even if the information I receive is shallow, I can't do without it. And here the difference between epistemic authority and expertise becomes important. Following Goldman, I said earlier that expertise provides epistemic resources to novices. The issue is what sort of resources those are. I suggest they consist of evidence about evidence, as well as evidence about the adequacy of one's evidence, methods, standards, and criteria. Even when I'm ignorant about what another epistemic's agents are, the information that he believes something is epistemically significant, at least assuming he's not known to be epistemically incompetent. You know, that there are peers or people who are not all that far from being peers, or people who are well above me who believe that not P when I believe that P, is information that's valuable to me in assessing whether I should continue to believe that P. And I think that that's something that we want to take seriously, but that requires holding on to our reasons. It requires not preempting, it requires not throwing them out, but saying, given that I have these first-order reasons for believing that P, does the fact that Georg believes that not P give me reason to worry about my belief? If the answer is yes, that's valuable information, but it's valuable information because it enables, if all I know is that he disbelieves it, all it does is prompt me to look further. But that prompting may be very important because it undercuts my complacency with respect to the belief. And I think even the news that an epistemic superior disagrees with me should not be decisive. It provides a reason, and maybe even a strong reason. Maybe it's strong enough that I should defer to the expert, thinking that his evidence, whatever it is strong enough to settle the issue. But remember the advice about looking for a second opinion. Sometimes the news that a superior disagrees with me is evidence that I should look further. Rather than replacing my reasons, I should perhaps consider whether I should suspend judgment, or consider how my belief that not P is already woven into my fabric of commitments. What does it support? What supports it? How strong or resilient are these supports? How confident should I be? What reasons, criteria, and methods lose their mooring if I give up on this belief? You can't do these things one by one, is what I'm saying. The acceptance or rejection of a proposition brings with it a cascade of consequences. So does the decision to suspend judgment. I suggest that the news that an epistemically superior agent disagrees with me calls into question my belief and my basis for the belief. But to call something into question is not to supply an answer. So what should I do in the face of disagreement, of superior expert disagreement? Answer, it depends. Thank you.